That's not his ashes.
Stood up in that church basement and said 7 words that changed my life forever. She wasn't even supposed to raise you. The room went dead silent. Fork stopped midair. Every single eye in that room turned to me. I was standing there in my black dress, holding a paper plate of funeral casserole I hadn't touched. My mother's ashes sitting 20 feet away in an urn still warm from the crematorium. And my own aunt had just told me my entire life was a lie. Your mother spent 38 years lying to protect a secret this family buried on purpose, Carol said, louder now, like she'd been waiting years to say it out loud. And now that she's gone, maybe it's finally time somebody told you the truth. My throat closed up. What secret? I managed to say. That's all I could get out. Carol just looked away. My Uncle Robert grabbed her by the arm and pulled her toward the parking lot before she could say another word. And just like that, the bomb she'd dropped was left sitting in the middle of that church basement, ticking, while everyone went right back to eating potato salad like nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't sleep the whole week after. Because once someone tells you that your entire life is built on a lie, you cannot put that thought down and walk away from it. Not ever. I had no idea, standing frozen in that church basement in my funeral dress, that the secret my family had buried wasn't just about my mother. It was about who I really was, and it was about to tear my entire world apart. My name is Diane Whitfield. I was 44 years old, recently divorced, raising 2 teenagers alone, working as a claims adjuster in a small Ohio town, and grieving the only mother I had ever known. Eleanor had raised me on Cypress Street, worked double shifts at a diner after my father left when I was 6, and never once in 38 years hinted at any secret worth burying. So when Carol dropped that grenade and walked away without picking up the pieces, something in me cracked wide open. If you've ever had family drop a bombshell and then refuse to explain it, you already know exactly how this feels. And I promise, this story goes somewhere you won't expect. Before we go further, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because Legacy Whisper brings you real stories about family, betrayal, and the truths that always claw their way to the surface. Now, let's get back to it. I called my ex-husband, Greg, that same night. Not because we were close anymore, but because he was the only person outside the family who had known my mother well enough to maybe make sense of what Carol said. He didn't have any answers either, but he said something that stuck with me. Diane, in 18 years of marriage, I never once saw your mother's guard drop, not once. Whatever this is, it's real, and it's big, and she took it to her grave on purpose. That was not the comfort I was looking for. It was the opposite. It confirmed the one thing I was desperately hoping wasn't true. That this wasn't a misunderstanding, or an old family grudge blown out of proportion. Something had actually been hidden, and everyone who should have told me had chosen not to. The days after the funeral blurred together in gray fog. I went back to work because bills don't care that you buried your mother. I made dinner for Sophie and Marcus because they still needed to eat. But every night, once the house went quiet, I sat at my mother's old kitchen table and stared at the boxes stacked against the wall. Boxes I hadn't found the strength to open. Carol's words kept circling back like a moth that wouldn't leave the porch light alone. She wasn't even supposed to raise you. Raised by who else? My mother was. My mother. There had never been a question about that in my whole life. I would lie awake replaying the funeral over and over, trying to remember if I had missed some earlier sign, some moment where the truth had almost slipped out and I simply hadn't been paying attention. I called Carol 3 times that week. She never answered, and on the 4th try, her voicemail box was full, which felt less like an accident and more like a decision. I called Robert next, and he gave me the kind of vague, uncomfortable non-answer that told me he knew something too, and that the family had made some silent pact to keep it buried. Diane, honey, let it rest, he said, his voice tight in a way I had never heard from him before. Your mother wanted it that way. Digging this up isn't going to bring her back, and it isn't going to do you any good either. But that's the thing about digging up a secret. Once you know it's there, you cannot simply walk away from the hole. The not knowing becomes its own kind of grief, stacked right on top of the grief you're already carrying. And some nights, I honestly couldn't tell which one was keeping me awake. It was my 17-year-old daughter, Sophie, who finally gave me the push. She found me one night in front of those unopened boxes, tears drying on my face without me realizing I'd started crying. "Mom," she said, sitting beside me, "if there's an answer in this house, it's in one of these boxes. You have to look. You'll never forgive yourself if you don't." She was right. So that Saturday, while Marcus was at soccer practice, I opened the first box. It was mostly what you'd expect. Old photographs, church bulletins, my report cards from elementary school my mother had kept for nearly 4 decades. But it was the second box, tucked beneath the stack of old quilts, where everything changed. Inside was a manila envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with tape, gone brittle. Written across the front in my mother's careful cursive were 4 words that dropped my stomach through the floor. "For Diane." When ready, my hands trembled as I peeled it open. Inside was a birth certificate, not the one framed in my mother's hallway. A different one. A different name where mine should have been. And a different mother's name entirely. Margaret and Sullivan. Born the same date as me. Same hospital. Same town. But the mother listed wasn't Eleanor Whitfield. It was a name I had never heard in my life. Patricia Sullivan. "Mom," Sophie whispered, "is that you?" I didn't know. Underneath the certificate was a letter, the handwriting messier, more urgent than my mother's, dated 38 years earlier, just weeks after I was born. "I am not going to be able to keep her," it read. "You know I can't. Please, Eleanor, you're the only one I trust with her. Please raise her as your own. Don't ever let her think she wasn't wanted. Take care of my daughter." It was signed Patricia. I sat on that floor for what felt like an hour, every certainty I had about my own identity dissolving like sugar in warm water. Eleanor Whitfield, the woman who braided my hair before school, sat up all night when I had the flu, and walked me down the aisle because my father never showed. Was not my birth mother. I wasn't angry yet. I was breathless. And underneath the confusion, one terrifying question surfaced. If Patricia Sullivan was my birth mother, was she still alive? And why had my entire family let me believe a lie for 38 years? The next few weeks became an obsession. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus at work. My boss called me into his office twice to ask if everything was okay. And I lied both times because how do you explain that your entire identity just cracked open like an egg on the kitchen floor? At night, I would lie in bed and run through every memory I had of my childhood, searching for cracks I might have missed. The way Eleanor sometimes went quiet when people asked about my birth. The way she flinched, just slightly, every single time someone commented on how I didn't look much like her. I had noticed those things my whole life, and never once questioned them, because when you love someone, you don't go looking for reasons to doubt them. I searched records, called county offices, drove to sit in a records office and beg a clerk to help me trace a stranger who had apparently given me life. The clerk, a kind older woman named Rosalind, must have seen the desperation on my face, because she stayed 40 minutes past her shift pulling old archived documents for me without ever asking why. What I found nearly stopped my heart. Patricia Sullivan hadn't vanished after signing that letter. She had lived just 90 minutes away, in a town called Ridgefield, my entire life. 90 minutes. I could have driven there and back on a lunch break. I had probably driven past the exit for her town 100 times on my way to visit friends, never once knowing. And there was something else, something that made my hands go cold under those buzzing fluorescent lights. Patricia wasn't a stranger who gave up a baby. She was my mother's younger sister. Eleanor and Patricia were sisters, which meant Carol and Robert weren't just my mother's siblings. They were Patricia's siblings too. They had all known, every single one of them, for 38 years, that I wasn't Eleanor's biological daughter, that I was her niece, raised as her own because my birth mother couldn't keep me. And not one of them had ever said a word. I confronted Robert first. I drove to his house unannounced and stood on his porch until he opened the door. And when he saw the birth certificate in my hand, his face went pale as chalk. "Diane," he said, "you need to sit down." "I don't want to sit down," I told him. "I want the truth. All of it." Right now, over the next 2 hours, my uncle told me a story buried under 38 years of silence. Patricia had been 19 when she got pregnant, unmarried, involved with a man who left town before I was even born. She wanted to keep me. She wanted to raise me herself. But the family, led by my grandmother, decided an unmarried teenage mother would shame the family name in their small, conservative town. Eleanor, married but unable to have children after a difficult miscarriage the year before, offered to raise me as her own. It was framed as a gift that helped everyone. But Patricia hadn't given me up willingly. She'd been pressured, guilt-tripped, worn down until she believed giving up her daughter was the only loving choice she had. For 38 years, she lived 90 minutes away, forbidden by an unspoken family agreement from ever reaching out. She used to ask about you, Robert said quietly. Every family gathering. How's Diane doing in school? Did she get into that college? Did Diane's wedding go well? She never stopped asking, Diane. She just wasn't allowed to know the answers firsthand. There were years she'd bring a small wrapped gift to Christmas, something for you, and hand it to your mother in the kitchen where nobody else could see. And Eleanor would put your name on the tag like it came from her. I sat there in stunned silence. Grief and fury tangled together in my chest, picturing every birthday of my childhood a little differently now, wondering how many of those presents under the tree had actually come from a woman I'd never met. Is she still alive? I asked. Patricia, is she still alive right now? Robert nodded slowly, not quite meeting my eyes. Last I heard, yes. Lives alone. Never married. Never had other children. Never had other children. The words landed like a stone in still water. I didn't sleep that night. Somewhere on the dark highway home, I made a decision that terrified me. I was going to find Patricia Sullivan, no matter how many family lies stood in the way. It took nearly 2 weeks to work up the courage. Finally, on a gray Saturday, I told my kids I was visiting a friend and drove the 90 minutes to Ridgefield with my hands locked on the wheel. The house was small, a bungalow with a wraparound porch and a garden gone a little wild. I sat outside for 20 minutes before I could make myself get out. When the door finally opened, I found myself looking at a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes that were, I realized with a jolt, exactly the shape and color of my own. She stared at me, confused at first, then something shifted, like recognition breaking across still water. Her hand flew to her mouth. Diane, she whispered, not a question, a certainty. How did you know? I asked. Because you have my mother's eyes, she said. Tears already falling, and my sister's smile. And I have spent 38 years imagining this exact moment, praying it would come, and terrified it never would. We stood on that porch crying until she finally took my hand and asked if I wanted to come inside. Over the next few hours, sitting in a living room that smelled like cinnamon, candles, and old books, surrounded by photographs of me as a baby that I never knew existed, Patricia told me everything. There was a photo album on her coffee table, worn soft at the edges from being opened too many times, filled with newspaper clippings about my high school graduation. A grainy photo of my wedding day taken from across a parking lot, because she hadn't been allowed to come inside. A printout of an old social media post where I'd mentioned getting a new job. She had been quietly collecting fragments of my life for decades. The way you'd collect water in cupped hands. Never enough. But never willing to stop trying. She told me about being 19 and terrified. Desperate to raise her own daughter, no matter how hard it would be. She told me about the pressure from my grandmother, insisting that giving me to Eleanor was the only way to protect the family and give me a stable life. About signing that letter with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. About driving away from the hospital without her baby, staring at the empty car seat the whole way home. About years of forced silence. At every holiday, every birthday, she wasn't invited to. Every single milestone she was only allowed to hear about secondhand. Through Robert, in hushed phone calls when no one else was listening. I wanted to fight for you, she said, her voice breaking. Every single day, I wanted to fight for you. But your grandmother made it clear that if I tried, if I ever said a word to you about the truth, the whole family would turn its back on both of us. And I was so afraid of losing what little connection I had left, even from a distance, that I stayed silent. I have hated myself for that silence every day since. I picked up the grainy photo from my wedding day, the one taken from across the parking lot, and studied it for a long time. I remembered that day clearly, remembered scanning the crowd outside the venue and feeling a strange flicker of a stranger's face that didn't belong there. A woman standing near the trees, who left before the ceremony started. I had thought nothing of it at the time, now understood exactly who she was, and the weight of that realization nearly buckled me where I sat. She had come. She had stood outside in the cold on one of the biggest days of my life, close enough to see me in my dress. And then she had turned around and driven 90 minutes home alone, because she wasn't allowed to walk through the door. I asked why Eleanor never told me either. Why she carried the secret to her deathbed instead of giving me the truth while she could. Patricia's answer broke something open in me. Eleanor loved you so much, she said. She was terrified that if you knew, you'd stop seeing her as your mother. She wasn't protecting the secret for the family's sake. By the end, she was protecting it because she was scared of losing you. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd let you make the choice to find me, rather than forcing it on you. She left that envelope on purpose. She wanted you to have the truth, on your own terms. That single detail changed everything. My mother hadn't buried the secret out of shame. She'd buried it out of a fear so human couldn't stay angry at her. She loved me enough to raise me as her own, and loved me enough, in the end, to leave the door open. But my anger toward the rest of the family, toward Carol and Robert and everyone who stayed silent for 38 years, didn't disappear so easily. Their silence hadn't come from love and fear. It came from something colder: shame, reputation, the comfort of never facing an uncomfortable truth at the holiday table. I started driving to Ridgefield every other weekend, slowly building something neither of us had expected to have. A relationship between a mother and daughter who had lost 38 years, but refused to lose whatever time remained. Word got back to the family fast, the way it always does. Carol called me one evening, her voice tight. I heard you found Patricia, she said. I heard you're spending time with her now. I am, I said. Do you have a problem with that? A long pause. I just don't understand why you dig all this up. Eleanor raised you. Eleanor loved you. Why does the rest of it matter now? Something in me that had been building for weeks finally found its voice. Because you're the one who stood up at my mother's funeral and told me there was a secret this family buried on purpose, I said. You dug it up, Carol. You just didn't expect me to actually go find the truth. You wanted to feel powerful for one moment, and then you wanted to walk away and let me sit in the confusion while you went back to pretending everything was fine. That was never fair. Not to me, and not to Patricia. Carol didn't have an answer. She never really did. But saying those words out loud gave me a peace I hadn't expected. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply asked for the truth. The real turning point came 4 months later, at my cousin's wedding, where nearly the entire extended family would be under one roof for the first time since the funeral. I almost didn't go, but Patricia convinced me. You have nothing to be ashamed of, she said. Walk in with your head up. You've earned that. So I did. I walked into that reception hall with Patricia beside me. Because if my birth mother was going to be a permanent part of my life, the family needed to accept that, whether it was comfortable or not. The room went quiet, the same way it had at the funeral, except this time the silence felt different. This time I wasn't the confused, grieving woman in the middle of a secret she didn't understand. I was standing beside the woman who gave birth to me, both of us in matching navy dresses we hadn't planned, both of us with our heads held high, and the family that had spent 38 years pretending this truth didn't exist had no choice but to finally look it directly in the eye. I could feel every set of eyes in that reception hall land on us. And for the first time since the funeral, it didn't feel small under that weight. I felt steady. Carol approached near the dessert table about 20 minutes later, her face flushed, clearly having had a glass of wine too many to steady her nerves. Patricia, she said, her voice tight. It's been a long time. It has, Patricia said calmly, not a trace of anger in her voice, just plain, unshakable fact. 38 years, actually, since this family decided I wasn't allowed to be part of my daughter's life. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. Carol opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, some kind of excuse or explanation, but nothing came out. Something shifted in her face, shame, and something close to grudging respect. She mumbled something about needing to check on the cake and walked away. And this time let her go without chasing after answers. Because for the first time, I didn't need her to give me any. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation you might expect. But it was exactly the justice I needed. Not revenge, not punishment, just the plain, undeniable fact that the truth was finally out in the open. And no one in that room could pretend otherwise. Over the following year, my relationship with Patricia deepened into something I never expected at 44. A second mother, not a replacement for Eleanor, but in addition a woman who had loved me from a distance, my whole life, and finally got to love me up close. She came to Marcus's soccer games and cheered louder than anyone in the bleachers. She helped Sophie pick out a dress for homecoming, something Eleanor would have loved doing too, and I let myself feel the ache of that instead of running from it. Sophie and Marcus started calling her Grandma Pat, and the joy on Patricia's face, the first time Marcus said those two words out loud, was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. I learned to hold two truths at once. Eleanor was my mother in every way that mattered for the first 44 years of my life, and nothing about the truth diminished her sacrifices. But Patricia was also my mother, in blood and in the quiet, persistent love she carried across 90 miles and 38 years of forced silence. Both things were true. Both women deserved to be honored, even though the family around them had failed, for far too long, to let either of them fully claim that role. As for Carol and Robert, and the rest of the family who kept the secret, I didn't cut them off though. Things changed permanently. I stopped attending gatherings out of obligation. I stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. And slowly, some of them began to apologize. Not with grand speeches, but small, quiet acknowledgments over time. Robert became the one who worked hardest to make things right, visiting Patricia regularly. I let fear keep me silent too long, he told me once. I'm not doing that anymore. 2 years after that first knock on Patricia's door, we held a small family dinner at her house in Ridgefield. Nothing fancy, just a home-cooked meal, mismatched chairs pulled around a table too small for everyone, and the kind of easy laughter that only comes when people have finally stopped hiding from each other. Marcus told a story about his soccer coach that had everyone in tears laughing. Sophie helped Patricia clear the plates, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm. They'd been doing it for years instead of months. Robert brought a bottle of wine and toasted, a little clumsily, to second chances. And nobody in that room needed him to explain what he meant. At one point during that dinner, Patricia reached across the table and took my hand, the same way Eleanor used to do at every dinner throughout my childhood. And she said something I will never forget. I spent 38 years believing I lost you forever, she said, her voice thick. I used to sit in this house on your birthday every single year and wonder what you looked like, what your laugh sounded like, whether you were happy. I want you to know, every single day since you knocked on my door has felt like getting a piece of my life back that I thought was gone for good. Thank you for not letting the silence win. I couldn't speak for a long moment. I just squeezed her hand back, and across the table, I caught Sophie watching us with tears in her own eyes. And I understood, in that moment, that this wasn't just my healing. It belonged to all of us. I think about that moment often. I think about how easy it would have been to let Carol's careless comment fade into nothing. To let the family's decades of silence stay buried the way they intended. To protect my own comfort by never asking the hard questions. But the truth has a way of finding light eventually, whether we go looking for it or it comes looking for us. The families who love us the most aren't always the families who tell us everything. Sometimes love looks like sacrifice. We don't understand until years later. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is walk toward a truth everyone else spent a lifetime trying to bury. Because on the other side of it is more love than we ever imagined possible. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments. Have you ever uncovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew? These stories matter, and your voice matters just as much as mine. And if you believe every hidden truth deserves to see the light, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. This has been Legacy Whisper, and I will see you in the next story.